You stand in the drawing room of a fine London townhouse, watching your childhood friend Emily sign away her existence. The year is 1851, and the morning light streams through tall windows onto mahogany furniture and Persian carpets, illuminating what should be a joyous occasion. Emily's hand trembles as she places her signature on the marriage certificate, the final stroke of the pen that will legally erase her. In precisely 3 minutes, she will cease to exist as a person under British law. Everything she owns, the modest inheritance from her grandmother, the jewelry her father gave her, even the diary hidden beneath her mattress will belong to her husband. Her body, her choices, her very identity will dissolve into his legal shadow. The witnesses applaud politely. No one mentions that they've just observed a woman's legal death. Before we descend deeper into this forgotten chamber of history, if you're fascinated by the untold realities behind the romanticized past, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. And please drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. It never ceases to amaze me that we're all here, scattered across continents and time zones, bound together by our hunger to understand what really happened in the shadows of history. The transformation is instant and absolute. The moment the clergyman pronounces Emily and her husband united, she becomes what legal scholars called civilly dead. This isn't poetry or exaggeration. This is the precise legal term used in Victorian England to describe a married woman's status. Sir William Blackstone, whose commentaries on the laws of England shaped British jurisprudence throughout the 1800s, explained it with chilling clarity. By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage. Suspended. As though she were a painting removed from the wall, a clock that stopped ticking at the altar. The doctrine of coverture, inherited from medieval common law and perfected during Queen Victoria's reign, operated with mechanical precision. It transformed approximately 200,000 British women each year from legal persons into legal property. Between 1837 and 1901, during Victoria's 64-year reign, roughly 12 million British women experienced this transformation. 12 million legal erasures, each one documented, witnessed, celebrated. The system wasn't hidden or shameful. It was codified in statute, taught in universities, defended by judges, and upheld by the established Church of England. The leading legal minds of the age considered coverture not merely reasonable but necessary, a cornerstone of civilized society. Lord Chancellor Cranworth, ruling on a landmark case in 1852, declared that the law of England is clear. A married woman has no separate existence from her husband. When a woman challenged this doctrine, requesting the right to control her own inherited property, Cranworth dismissed her petition with words that echoed through courtrooms for decades. To grant such a request would overturn the natural order of creation itself. This natural order was taught to children in schoolrooms across the British Empire. Young girls learned that marriage was their highest calling, their sacred duty, their biological destiny. They memorized Bible verses about wifely submission. They studied conduct manuals that explained how a proper wife should anticipate her husband's needs, suppress her own desires, and find fulfillment in complete self-abnegation. What they did not learn, could not learn, was what marriage would actually require of their bodies and spirits. The scale of systematic ignorance was staggering. Sex education for Victorian women consisted of terrified whispers and deliberate silence. Mothers who attempted to prepare their daughters were considered vulgar. Dr. William Acton, one of Victorian England's most respected physicians, published influential texts stating that the majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. He claimed that women who expressed sexual desire were suffering from moral and physical disease. This wasn't fringe opinion. This was mainstream medical doctrine, taught at Cambridge and Oxford, practiced in London's finest hospitals. Elizabeth Blackwell, one of the first female physicians, documented what this ignorance created. In her private correspondence from 1859, she described examining newly married women who believed they were dying, who had no framework to understand what their husbands were doing to them, who thought the bleeding and pain were punishment for some unknown sin. These women came from educated families, daughters of merchants and lawyers and clergymen. If wealth and status couldn't protect them from traumatic ignorance, what chance did working-class women have? The system demanded their silence. Victorian society operated on an intricate code of respectability that made suffering invisible. A woman could be raped by her husband every night, and the term itself was legally meaningless. Marital rape was not recognized as a crime in Britain until 1991. In the Victorian era, the very concept was considered absurd. How could a husband rape his wife when the marriage contract granted him permanent, irrevocable consent to her body? Judge Matthew Hale's ruling from 1736 remained binding precedent throughout the 1800s. The husband cannot be guilty of a rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife, for by their mutual matrimonial consent and contract, the wife hath given up herself in this kind unto her husband which she cannot retract. They gathered each morning in drawing-rooms across London, Manchester, Birmingham, Edinburgh. Middle-class wives pouring tea with steady hands, their faces carefully composed, their high-necked dresses concealing bruises that never fully healed. They discussed the weather, the servants, the latest fashions from Paris. They did not discuss what happened in their bedrooms. They could not look away from the performance of contentment, even as they drowned behind their eyes. The economic architecture of Victorian marriage ensured that escape was impossible. When a woman married, everything she owned became her husband's property. Her inheritance, her clothing, her personal possessions, even gifts given specifically to her, all transferred to his legal control. If she had money in a bank account, it became his money. If she owned land, it became his land. If she worked and earned wages, those wages belonged to him by law. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870 made minor reforms, allowing women to keep their own earnings, but only if their husbands agreed not to claim them. The act explicitly stated that this was a revocable privilege, not a right. A husband could change his mind at any time and seize his wife's wages. The 1882 Property Act expanded women's rights further, but judges routinely found creative ways to rule in husbands' favor. Legal reform meant little when the entire judicial system was staffed by men who believed in female subordination. Caroline Norton learned this brutally. In 1836, she left her abusive husband, George Norton, after years of physical violence. George responded by taking custody of their 3 young sons and refusing to let Caroline see them. He also claimed all the money Caroline earned from her successful career as a novelist. Caroline had written best-selling books, but under coverture, the copyrights and royalties belonged to George. She spent years campaigning for legal reform, writing pamphlets, and lobbying Parliament. Her advocacy eventually contributed to the Custody of Infants Act of 1839 and the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857. But the laws changed too late to save her own children. She never regained custody. One of her sons died in a riding accident while in George's care, and Caroline was not notified until after the funeral. They could not look away from women like Caroline, educated, articulate, well-connected women who still could not protect themselves or their children. If privilege offered no protection, what hope existed for those without famous friends or literary talent? The marriage market operated with the efficiency of any commodities exchange. During the London season, from April through July, wealthy families brought their daughters to a concentrated series of balls, dinners, and social events designed explicitly for matchmaking. Young women were presented at court to Queen Victoria herself, wearing white gowns and ostrich plumes, curtsying before the monarch who embodied both imperial power and domestic submission. Victoria had 9 children and famously wrote to her daughter that pregnancy made her feel like a dog or a cow. The season wasn't courtship. It was livestock auction, dressed in silk and diamonds. Mothers evaluated potential sons-in-law based on annual income, property holdings, and social connections. Fathers negotiated marriage settlements like business contracts because that's precisely what they were. A typical middle-class marriage involved detailed legal agreements specifying dowry amounts, jointure arrangements, and inheritance provisions. Love was incidental at best, dangerous at worst. A woman who married for love rather than security was considered reckless and foolish. The pressure to marry created its own pathology. Women who remained unmarried past age 25 were pitied and mocked as spinsters, old maids, women who had failed at their primary purpose. The economic reality made their situation genuinely precarious. Unmarried women had few career options. They could become governesses, underpaid and socially isolated, living in other people's homes. They could do piecework sewing, destroying their eyesight for pennies. They could depend on male relatives' charity, becoming unpaid servants in their brothers' households. Marriage was economic survival, and everyone knew it. What happened when that survival strategy required submitting to violence? Lady Constance Bulwer-Lytton described her privileged but constrained existence in letters that weren't published until after her death. Despite her family's wealth and aristocratic status, she had no control over her own life, no ability to pursue her intellectual interests, no escape from suffocating expectations. She wrote, "We are educated to be ornaments, trained to please, and punished for thinking." She secretly joined the suffragette movement in the early 1900s and was imprisoned and force-fed after a hunger strike. The torture damaged her health permanently. She died at age 54, her body broken by a lifetime of restriction and rebellion. They could not look away from the contradictions. Society claimed to worship women, placing them on pedestals as moral guardians and angels of the house. But worship and respect are not the same thing. You place statues on pedestals. You place things you want to admire from a distance without allowing them any power or agency. The medical establishment pathologized female existence itself. Victorian physicians believed that women's reproductive organs controlled their entire bodies and minds. Any physical complaint, headache, fatigue, digestive problems was attributed to the uterus. Any emotional expression, anger, sadness, frustration, was diagnosed as hysteria, derived from the Greek word for womb. The diagnosis was self-fulfilling. Women who were trapped in intolerable situations developed symptoms of psychological distress. Doctors then used those symptoms as proof that women were naturally unstable, constitutionally unsuited for education, property rights, or political participation. The rest cure, developed by Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell in the 1870s, became a standard treatment for women diagnosed with nervous disorders. The cure consisted of absolute bed rest, isolation from friends and family, prohibition of all reading and writing, and forced feeding of high-calorie foods. Women were literally imprisoned in their bedrooms, forbidden from any mental or physical activity. The treatment often lasted months. Charlotte Perkins Gilman underwent the rest cure in 1887 and nearly lost her mind. She later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a haunting story of a woman driven to madness by enforced inactivity and medical gaslighting. The story ends with the narrator peeling yellow wallpaper off her bedroom walls, crawling in circles around the room, completely dissociated from reality. It wasn't fiction. It was testimony. Consider the case of Isabella Robinson. In 1858, she left her husband Henry after 16 years of marriage. Henry was a civil engineer, respectable and successful. Isabella's family was wealthy and well-connected. She had every advantage Victorian society could offer, but Henry was also systematically cruel. He monitored her correspondence, restricted her contact with friends and family, controlled every penny she spent, and subjected her to what she described in her diary as degrading acts she could not specify even in her private writings. When Isabella finally fled to her family's home, Henry sued for restitution of conjugal rights, a legal action that required a wife to return to her husband's home and resume sexual relations. Isabella countersued for divorce on grounds of cruelty. The case went to trial in 1858, 1 year after the Matrimonial Causes Act made civil divorce possible. Previously, divorce required a private act of Parliament and cost thousands of pounds, making it accessible only to the wealthiest families. The 1857 Act allowed divorce through the courts, but maintained different standards for men and women. A man could divorce his wife for adultery alone. A woman had to prove adultery plus another offense: cruelty, desertion, bigamy, incest, or sodomy. Isabella's diary became evidence in the trial. She had written about her growing friendship with a young doctor, Edward Lane. The friendship was probably platonic, though Isabella's diary entries suggested strong emotional attachment. Henry's lawyers used the diary to paint Isabella as an adulteress and hysteric. They hired medical experts who testified that Isabella's complaints about Henry's sexual demands proved she was suffering from erotomania, an excessive and delusional form of female sexual desire. The judge ruled that Isabella had not proven sufficient cruelty and dismissed her divorce petition. Worse, he ruled that she had to return to Henry's custody. Isabella's own words, written in the privacy of her diary, had been used to imprison her. They could not look away from the perversity. A woman's private thoughts, never meant for any eyes but her own, became evidence of her moral depravity. The very act of having thoughts and feelings that deviated from absolute submission was presented as proof of insanity. The consequences rippled through generations. Children raised in these households learned that love meant ownership, that marriage meant surrender, that a man's authority was absolute and a woman's suffering was natural. Sons learned to dominate. Daughters learned to endure. The cycle reinforced itself with every wedding, every birth, every woman who disappeared into coverture and never re-emerged. Birth control was illegal, immoral, and unavailable to most women. The average Victorian woman was pregnant or nursing for approximately 15 years of her adult life. Each pregnancy was a gamble with death. Maternal mortality rates in 1850 were approximately 5 deaths per 1,000 births. That might sound low until you remember that most women had 6 to 10 children. A woman with 8 pregnancies faced a 4% chance of dying in childbirth, a terrifying lottery that played out in bedrooms across the country. Childbirth was agonizing. Anesthesia during labor was controversial throughout the early Victorian period. Doctors and clergymen argued that God had cursed women to bring forth children in pain, and that relieving that pain violated divine will. Queen Victoria finally changed medical opinion when she used chloroform during the birth of her 8th child in 1853. If the Queen herself could accept anesthesia, it must be respectable. But access was limited to wealthy women with progressive physicians. Most women labored without pain relief, attended by midwives or doctors who had little understanding of infection control or obstetric emergencies. The archive preserves one particularly haunting artifact: a collection of letters between 2 sisters, Margaret and Sarah Osborne, written between 1865 and 1877. Margaret married first, at age 20, to a man her father chose. Her letters to Sarah began cheerfully, describing her new home and social activities. Within 6 months, the tone shifted. Margaret wrote carefully, always conscious that her husband might read the letters, but Sarah could read between the lines. Margaret mentioned being tired, feeling unwell, having trouble sleeping. She stopped attending church. She stopped visiting friends. In one letter from 1867, Margaret wrote, "I have learned that a wife's greatest virtue is silence. There are things that happen in marriage which we must accept as God's will, though they tear at the soul." Sarah married in 1869, 2 years after that letter. Her tone was bright at first, then dimmed. By 1871, she and Margaret wrote in code, hiding their despair between lines about novels. Sarah urged Jane Eyre Jane's refusal to belong to any man. Margaret replied with Middlemarch, haunted by Dorothea's sterile marriage. The letters stop in 1877. Margaret died that year, age 32, puerperal fever, her 5th pregnancy in 12 years. Her final line, "I am so very tired, dearest. I do not think I shall mind whatever comes next." She never saw her daughter grow, nor the Married Women's Property Act of 1882 that came too late for her. Behind each reform lay graves and parish records listing women only as wives, their suffering reduced to statistics. The Victorian age ended with the Queen in 1901, but its shadow endured. Property and divorce laws shifted, yet the foundations of ownership remained. The suffragettes who chained themselves to railings were daughters of such women. They had watched endurance masquerade as virtue and vowed to end it. When women finally gained the vote in 1918, it wasn't granted, it was seized by persistence that could no longer be ignored. Today's nostalgia for traditional marriage depends on forgetting the bruises beneath lace sleeves, the diaries burned, the silences between lines of ink. Victorian marriage was no anomaly. It was the perfection of patriarchy, built and celebrated in plain sight. And so we return to that London drawing room in 1851. Emily signs her name, her life dissolving into her husband's. Applause. A carriage waits. She hesitates, turns once, and meets your eyes a look that crosses centuries, asking still, how many women's lives will it cost before we learn that love and ownership are not the same thing?